A controversial and highly debated idea that human impact has forced the Earth into a new geological epoch has recently begun to gain momentum. This idea is known as the Anthropocene. According to Welcome to the Anthropocene, the Anthropocene refers to the Earth's most recent geological time period as being human-influenced. It is based on global evidence demonstrating how humanity has impacted Earth's atmospheric, biospheric, geological and hydrological processes, resulting in the Anthropocene distinguished as a new period within the Holocene. Ultimately, the drivers of the Anthropocene, on the other hand, if they continue unabated through this century, may well threaten the viability of contemporary civilization and perhaps even the future existence of Homo sapiens. This, in turn, reverses our drive towards destroying our planetary habitat with such terrible outcomes foreseen in our near future. We seem to be doing little to prevent it. This leads to McKenzie Wark's statement, addressing the Anthropocene is not something to leave in the hands of those in charge, given that those in charge have mismanaged the end of prehistory time and time again. In support of Wark's statement, this video essay will explore two key shifts in history, the Industrial Revolution and World War II. It will highlight the key aspects that have led to the Anthropocene, as well as address what may have led to McKenzie Wark's statement. The essay will then conclude with the most recent stage of the Anthropocene, exploring whether Wark's statement is still relevant in today's society.
The Industrial Revolution was an important shift in Western society, however an even more important stage for the Anthropocene, as the 1800-1945 marked another significant transition in the history for humankind. What made the industrialization an important aspect for the Anthropocene was the enormous expansion in the use of fossil fuels. First coal, then oil, followed by gas. Previously, we had relied upon natural forms of energy, wind, water, plants and animals for over 200 years. However, the shift saw these societies using 4 to 5 times more energy in comparison to the agrarian societies, an even greater increase when compared to the hunting and gathering societies. To summarize, the carbon dioxide that we generated during the Industrial Revolution is still warming the planet today with the added emission we currently produce. Even if we stop generating emissions right now, the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere already is going to last tens of thousands of years, as well as the rising sea levels and temperatures. Thus, there is no doubt on the connection between the Industrial era and the Anthropocene. However, at the time, this was not a concern. Machines began to replace human labor. This founded the way for the huge increase in production capacity, in turn affecting all basic human needs: food, production, medicine, housing, and clothing. Society had created a system that allowed them to not only have things faster, but also make things better, thus resulting in the upheaval of economic, political and social structure as depicted in Adolf Menzel, The Iron Rolling Mill, an 1875 oil painting presenting the huge social change that had occurred. The work shows hundreds of workers that are exposed in this loud, ugly, mechanical, confusing, dangerous and domineering environment. Represented as a cog in the machine, they have lost all individuality within this painting. To summarize, all aspects of human life had been altered in some form, and these societies were convinced that life was inadequate without these shifts, as the sacrifices were worth the rewards. However, the environmental consequences of such massive change was not heavily promoted nor understood. Joseph Mallord William Turner constructed a beautiful mill painting depicting the social concerns at the time, directed towards the impact the industrial age was having on people's quality of life, their happiness and individuality, as he wrote about it in illustrated poems. You see, the fighting temeraire tug to her last berth to be broken up acts as a form of evidence showing society's real concerns. Were these the same concerns as those in charge? Perhaps not. For instance, early car manufacturers understood that cars would allow people to travel great distances in just a day, but nobody foresaw how profoundly these cars would impact upon the planet. So, although it is clearly argued that people at the time of the Industrial Revolution could have not possibly known the impact such actions of productions would have on the environment, in turn leading us into the era of the Anthropocene. So the question is, if those in charge knew about the impacts to come, would they have done things differently? Sir Richard Arkwright created a machine to speed up the process of making fabric. Originally, water wheel was used to power the machine, but this was replicated for larger and larger factories. It was now possible to turn out huge quantities of fabric that was never possible before. So in turn, Arkwright didn't just invent a spinning machine, he invented the modern factory. The spinning machine turned England into the powerhouse, leading the way for the Industrial Revolution. There was now access to goods in relatively inexpensive ways that were non-existent before. Yes, there were crowded tenements and dirty, unsafe factories, not to mention the impacts upon the environment. But it was a time of massive social progress, with great gains for medicine, health, literacy, and social mobility. This was the political and social drive at the time, so those in charge were not focused on the consequences but the gains that were on offer. Thus, addressing the Anthropocene is not something to leave in the hands of those in charge, as we found their aspirations to contradict the restrictions needed to avoid the Anthropocene today.
World War II is considered one of the bloodiest armed conflicts in history. The war lasted from 1939 to 1945 and was predominantly fought in Europe, across the Pacific, and Eastern Asia. The war saw the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan battle against the Allied nations of Great Britain, France, the United States, Australia, and the Soviet Union. Shortly after World War II, when the atomic bombs fell and our consumption of natural resources increased, the Earth entered the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is considered a new geologic time when humanity's environmental reach left a mark in sediments worldwide. The following will examine the effects nuclear war has had on the Earth, particularly the devastation caused by the nuclear weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan by the United States in 1945 during World War II. It will also highlight the work of the Hikabusha and the Century War exhibition, as well as address McKenzie Wark's statement, addressing the Anthropocene is not something to leave in the hands of those in charge. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by the first ever atomic bombs used in the history of warfare. The city of Hiroshima was impacted by the first atomic bomb ever used in a military operation on August 6, 1945 at 8:16 a.m. The city was the primary target of a United States mission, with the bomb exploding 1,900 feet above Shima Hospital. The bomb itself was affectionately named Little Boy and had an exploding force equivalent to 12,500 tons of TNT. Its impact destroyed approximately 90% of the whole city. The second atomic bomb, entitled Fat Man, was dropped over Nagasaki on August 9, 1945 at 11:02 a.m. The bomb detonated at 1,650 feet and had an exploding force of 22,000 tons of TNT. The effect the two atomic bombs had on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was devastating. 45,000 people died in Hiroshima on the first day of the bombing, and a further 19,000 during the subsequent 4 months. In Nagasaki, 22,000 people died, and another 17,000 within 4 months. Unrecorded deaths of military personnel and foreign workers may have added considerably to these figures. The impact the nuclear bombs had on the Japanese people is explored in the Sensory War 1914 to 2014 art exhibition. Artworks by survivors of the 1945 nuclear attacks were displayed in the exhibition, which was held in the Manchester Art Gallery. The exhibition explores how artists have communicated the impact of war on the body, mind, environment, and human senses. The works displayed depicted horrific scenes from the bombings. They were created on request by the Japanese broadcaster NHK during the 1970s. 12 paintings and drawings by the Hikabusha, which translates to bomb exposed people, were exhibited. The atomic bombs also had a significant impact on the natural environment. Both explosions yielded approximately 200 different types of radioactive isotopes. Isotopes consist of nuclear fission particles of uranium and plutonium that escape fission. Following the explosions, these isotopes along with other irradiated materials were carried high into the Earth's atmosphere. The mixing of enormous amounts of airborne radiation combined with high temperatures and thermal currents led to rainfall in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki approximately 30 minutes after the bombings occurred. The mixing of these particles with the carbon residue from citywide fires resulted in a phenomenon known as black rain. Black rain was a sticky dark residue that was highly radioactive. It contaminated food and water supplies, and, if ingested or consumed, caused severe radiation poisoning. The initial burst of radiation from the two bombs also created residual radioactivity which heavily affected soil and other natural materials in the blast areas. Physicists who examined the detonation site in Hiroshima found high levels of radioactivity in the soil. It is believed that this is responsible for the many instances of radiation affecting the flora and fauna in the area. It is evident the detrimental impact nuclear wars had on both mankind and the natural environment. As previously mentioned, shortly after World War II, the Earth entered the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene refers to the Earth's most recent geological time period as being human influence. From this, it can be suggested that the atomic bombs, specifically the bombs dropped during World War II, are anthropogenic artifacts. This is because they are man-made weapons that have impacted both mankind and the natural environment. This leads into McKenzie Wark's statement, addressing the Anthropocene is not something to leave in the hands of those in charge. The US President at the time, Harry S. Truman, was warned by his advisors that any attempt to invade Japan would result in horrific American casualties. After receiving this information, President Truman ordered the bombs to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring World War II to a swift end. This was the reasoning behind the nuclear attacks. Although the attack was considered a success, with Japan soon surrendering, those in charge did not take into consideration the impact these two bombs would have on mankind and the natural environment at the time. Thus, when addressing the Anthropocene, we should not leave it in the hands of those in charge, because it has been shown in history that there is no real consideration of the consequences of war and its impact on the Anthropocene.
The initial stages of the Anthropocene show us how humans have heavily influenced the world around us to what it has become today. We continue to live in a human-influenced environment, which constantly is changing and evolving due to the human impacts brought about by those in charge. It is those in charge who drop atomic bombs and have exhausted the use of fossil fuels, all for benefits other than the greater good of the planet and its inhabitants. Still today we see those in charge making decisions and creating situations where we have to ask ethical questions regarding whether or not we are crossing the line between technology and the natural world. Two contemporary artists that demonstrate this ongoing issue in their art practice are Patricia Piccinini and Chris Jordan. Patricia Piccinini is a sculptor and mixed media artist whose artworks are influenced by her interest in the implications of genetic engineering, mutations in the relationship between the natural and the artificial. Her work, The Young Family, made in 2002, is a great reflection of the Anthropocene's impacts today, focusing on genetic engineering and the use of other species to grow human organs. The sculpture confronts the viewer to question the definition of what we consider natural and what we consider artificial. The strange hybrid figure is somewhat relatable to the audience through its human-like features and textures, which makes us feel uneasy and unsure, making us question whether it is ethically viable to grow human organs in other species. This work reflects the Anthropocene today, showing us and making us reflect on how it is impacting on our lives. Piccinini states in her artist statement in 1999, "Nature, the organic, is now the stratum through which the cutting edge of technology most regularly slices. The relevance of an oppositional positioning of nature and technology is, in my life at least, increasingly irrelevant. I take this as a given, but my real interest is in what this means to people. I begin with a very ambivalent attitude towards both technology and nature." Chris Jordan is a contemporary photographer whose art practice also reflects the aftermath of the Anthropocene. His work portrays the debris of our mass culture and the effects this has on our environment, and this is heavily reflected in his series Running the Numbers, made in 2007. He aims to shock us with his images and get us thinking about who really is doing the harm. People in charge, or each and every one of us? Jordan states in an interview, "One of the huge problems that faces our society right now is that this problem with our consumerism, and the resulting global warming, worldwide environmental destruction, the toxification of our oceans and the desertification of our agricultural lands, and so on, are not happening because there's an extremely bad person out there who is doing a huge amount of terrible consuming. This is happening because of the tiny incremental harm that every single one of us is doing as an individual." Looking at Jordan's work and understanding what he's portraying, we begin to see that McKenzie Wark's statement, addressing the Anthropocene is not something to leave in the hands of those in charge, is still seemingly relevant to today, but we begin to question who is the people in charge. We begin to see that it is not one whole person or group, but it is fact all of us. Collectively we are committing a vast and unsustainable act of taking, but we each are anonymous and no one is in charge or accountable for the consequences. I fear that in this process we are doing irreparable harm to our planet and to our individual spirits. In conclusion, it is evident the enormous economical, political and societal impacts the Industrial Revolution, World War II and contemporary consumerism has had on the Earth. In all three stages addressed, those in charge were and are not focused on the consequences of their actions, but rather what they can gain. The aspirations of those in charge contradict the restrictions needed in order to avoid the Anthropocene occurring. By addressing three different yet crucial stages within the Anthropocene, McKenzie Wark's statement, addressing the Anthropocene is not something to leave in the hands of those in charge, is strengthened. As time and time again, those in charge have mismanaged key aspects that have led to the Anthropocene, as humankind continually puts their own needs and desires above what is beneficial to Earth itself. However, this raises the question, who really is in charge of the Anthropocene? We are all responsible for the Earth's continued survival. This suggests that we are all in charge of addressing the Anthropocene. It's in our own hands.